Imagine a force of nature with 4 legs and teeth. This is Canine Titan, a 95-pound German Shepherd, and he is the most feared and respected member of the entire police force. He isn't just trained, he is a living, breathing weapon, a creature of pure, focused intensity. His bark isn't a sound, it's a physical shockwave that hits you in the chest. His eyes, a piercing, intelligent amber, hold no warmth, only a cold calculation that assesses every living thing as either a handler, a target, or a threat. For his partner, Officer Dan Miller, Titan is the ultimate guardian, a partner he trusts with his life. But for everyone else, he is a shadow of pure aggression, a dog so volatile that even other seasoned officers give his kennel a wide, cautious berth. The phrase "nobody could touch him" wasn't an exaggeration, it was a stark, terrifying fact. The story of Titan began like many great canine tales. Selected for his incredible drive and fearlessness, he was the star of his training class. He could track a scent for miles, take down a suspect with breathtaking speed, and find a single speck of hidden contraband. He and Dan formed a bond, but it was a bond built on work and command, not on affection. There were no gentle pats after a successful drill, no quiet moments of companionship. Their relationship was one of mutual respect between a soldier and his most powerful piece of equipment. Dan could command Titan with a word or a gesture, but the moment the work was done, the wall went back up. The dog would return to his kennel, a solitary king in a concrete and chain-linked domain, pacing with a restless energy that never seemed to fade. He was a legend, but a lonely one, a creature whose entire world was defined by a single, sharp edge: aggression. This is where our story takes an unexpected turn. It's a quiet Tuesday afternoon at the precinct when the universe decides to throw a curveball. Dan is doing some paperwork, trying to ignore the low, constant growl emanating from Titan's run. Suddenly, a small figure darts away from her mother, who is visiting the station on a community outreach day. Her name is Lily, and she's 6 years old. Before anyone can react, before a shout can even form in a throat, she has slipped through a partially open gate and is standing in the one place no one dares to go, Titan's space. A collective horror freezes everyone in the room. Time seems to stretch, thin and brittle. Dan's heart plummets. He sees the dog, the formidable weapon, and he sees the little girl in her bright yellow sundress, a tiny, fragile thing standing before a storm. Every instinct, every ounce of his training, screams that this will end in tragedy. He moves, but he knows he's too slow. He expects the snarling lunge, the devastating bite. He's already picturing the worst moment of his life. But that moment doesn't come. Instead, Titan goes still. Utterly, completely still. The low growl cuts off mid-breath. His powerful body, usually coiled like a spring, seems to loosen. Those intimidating amber eyes are locked not on a threat, but on a curiosity. Lily doesn't see a monster. She doesn't see a weapon or a legend. She sees a big, beautiful dog. And with the unshakable, innocent logic of a child, she smiles. She doesn't retreat in fear, she takes a small, hesitant step forward, her small hand outstretched. The air in the kennel is so thick with tension you could choke on it. Dan has his hand on his tranquilizer gun, his knuckles white, but some deep, unexplainable instinct, tells him to wait. To just watch. Lily, completely unaware of the danger she is in, begins to talk to Titan in a soft, sing-song voice, the kind reserved for lost kittens and favorite stuffed animals. "It's okay," she whispers. "You're a good boy, aren't you? You just look sad." And then it happens. The impossible. The German Shepherd, the animal that has known nothing but force and command his entire life, slowly, deliberately, lowers his massive head. He takes a single, cautious step towards her, his nose twitching, inhaling her scent. It's a movement devoid of all the aggression that has defined him. It's a question, not an attack. The little girl's hand, small and pale, reaches out further, her fingers just inches from his powerful muzzle. Every person watching holds their breath, their minds screaming with a single, unified thought: what happens when that innocent hand makes contact with this creature of pure instinct? Will the spell be broken? Will the gentle curiosity in the dog's eyes be instantly replaced by the fierce fire they all know so well? The fate of a little girl, the future of a legendary police dog, and the sanity of his handler all hang in the balance, suspended in the tiny, shrinking space between a child's fingertips and a dog's nose. The silence in the kennel was heavier than any sound Titan had ever made. It was a thick, suffocating blanket that smothered the usual noises of the precinct. Dan stood frozen, his training screaming at him to intervene, to grab the child and get her to safety. But his feet felt rooted to the concrete floor. He was witnessing something that defied every line in the K9 manual, something that went against the very nature of the animal he thought he knew. His eyes were locked on Titan, searching for any sign of the ticking time bomb he'd worked alongside for 3 years. A tensed muscle, a flicker of the lip, a low rumble in the chest, any signal that the switch was about to flip. But there was nothing. Just a profound, unnerving stillness. Lily's small hand hovered, a pale butterfly in the dim light of the kennel. Her mother, Sarah, stood rigid by the gate, a hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so complete she couldn't even make a sound. She wanted to rush in, to snatch her daughter back, but a single, sharp, almost imperceptible shake of Dan's head stopped her. He knew that any sudden movement, any scream, could be the very thing that triggered the disaster they were all desperately trying to avoid. This delicate, impossible moment was balanced on a knife's edge. And then, Lily's fingertips made contact. They didn't land with a pat, but with the lightest of touches, right on the bridge of Titan's broad, black nose. It was less of a touch and more of a question. Dan expected the dog to jerk back, to snap, to do anything but what he did. Titan closed his eyes. A long, slow blink. He stood there, allowing the touch, his massive head still lowered in a posture of submission Dan had only ever seen in defeated suspects. A single, quiet whiff of air escaped his nostrils, stirring the fine hairs on Lily's arm. "See, Mama?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's a good boy." That's when Dan noticed the change, a detail so small he almost missed it. It was the tail. Not a wag, not the stiff, alert flag of a working dog, but a slight, almost hesitant loosening at the very base. It was the first uncommanded, non-aggressive movement he had ever seen from Titan outside of direct obedience. His mind raced, flipping through the files of Titan's history. The dog had been sourced from a top-tier breeder who supplied dogs for military and police work. His pedigree was flawless, a lineage of champions in protection and detection. But there was a shadow in his past, a piece of the puzzle Dan had never been able to fit into place. The breeder had mentioned, almost in passing, that Titan's early weeks had been unusually stressful, that the litter had been isolated due to a canine parvovirus scare. For a critical period of his puppyhood, during the time when most dogs learn to trust and socialize, Titan had known only confinement and sickness. He had missed that window. He had learned the world was a place of threat and isolation before he ever learned it could be a place of gentle hands. As Lily continued her one-sided conversation, her small hand now gently stroking the coarse fur between his eyes, Dan felt a confusing storm of emotions. There was the ever-present, gut-wrenching fear for the child's safety. But underneath it, a new, strange feeling was budding, something that felt dangerously like hope. What if it wasn't just a fluke? What if this dog, this incredible asset he'd seen perform miracles, was capable of more than just force? The potential was staggering. A dog with Titan's drive and intelligence, but with the capacity for genuine connection, could be more than a tool. He could be a bridge, a K9 ambassador for community programs, a symbol of something beyond raw power. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying. But the real world was still right outside the kennel door. The other officers had gathered, their faces a mixture of awe and deep concern. Sergeant Evans, a man with 20 years on the force, put a firm hand on Dan's shoulder, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "Dan, this is a miracle, I'll give you that. But it's a dangerous one. You can't let this go to your head. That is not a pet. That is a loaded weapon. One wrong move, one bad day, and that little girl's luck runs out. We have protocols for a reason." Dan knew he was right. The rules were clear. A dog that displayed unpredictable behavior, especially around civilians, was a liability. A dog that allowed a civilian to touch it without a handler's direct command was, by the book, compromised. The standard procedure would be to bench Titan permanently. And for a dog like Titan, a life of confinement, deemed too dangerous for work and too volatile for adoption, often had only one grim outcome. The incredible thing happening right in front of him wasn't just challenging his understanding of his partner, it was threatening his very existence. Lily, oblivious to the life and death debate happening just feet away, was now telling Titan a rambling story about her lost teddy bear. The dog had settled onto his haunches, his head still low, his eyes fixed on her face as if her childish words were the most important thing he had ever heard. He was listening. It was the most unnerving part of it all. Dan looked from the serene, trusting face of the little girl to the intense, focused eyes of his canine partner, and then to the grim, worried faces of his colleagues. He was caught between a miracle and a mandate, between the heart-stopping potential of what he was witnessing and the cold, hard reality of the rules designed to keep everyone safe. The touch had happened. The world hadn't ended. But now, a new, more complicated tension had begun. The question was no longer just if Titan would hurt someone. The question had become, what do you do with a weapon that has, for one fleeting moment, shown you it has a soul? And how far are you willing to go to prove that one moment was real, when the cost of being wrong is unthinkable? The spell was broken, not by a growl or a snap, but by the soft, hesitant voice of Lily's mother. "Lily, honey," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of held-back tears. "It's time to go find your teddy bear." Lily looked up, her small hand pausing on Titan's head. The dog's eyes flickered towards the sound, and for a heart-stopping second, Dan saw the old guard come back up, a subtle tightening around the eyes. But then Lily patted him once more, said, "Bye, puppy," and skipped back towards the gate. Titan didn't move. He just watched her go, his head cocked as if listening to a song only he could hear. The moment the kennel gate clicked shut, the precinct erupted into a low hum of frantic activity and hushed arguments. Sarah scooped Lily into a fierce hug, her body trembling with delayed shock. Meanwhile, Sergeant Evans pulled Dan aside, his face a mask of grim professionalism. "My office. Now," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. As Dan followed, he glanced back at Titan. The dog had risen and was pacing the length of his run again, but the pacing was different. It wasn't the frantic, caged energy stride from before. It was slower, more thoughtful, his gaze constantly drifting to the spot where the little girl had been. In the stark, fluorescent light of the office, the debate was just as stark. "You saw what happened, Dan," Evans began, leaning heavily on his desk. "I've never seen anything like it. But that's the problem. It's an unknown. Our entire K9 program is built on predictability. On trust forged through rigorous training. That dog just rewrote the book in 60 seconds, and I don't like it." Dan fought to keep his voice level. "Sarge, with all due respect, he didn't just rewrite the book. He showed us a side of him we never knew was there. That's potential. That's a breakthrough." He could hear the desperation in his own voice. He wasn't just defending his partner, he was defending the flicker of hope he'd seen in Titan's eyes. "It's a liability," Evans countered, tapping a thick binder of protocols. "The review board will see it that way. A civilian, a child, made unsanctioned contact with a high-risk K9. The dog's focus was broken. By the book, Dan, he's compromised. He's benched, effective immediately, pending a full behavioral review." The word benched hit Dan like a physical blow. For a dog like Titan, being benched wasn't a vacation, it was a slow death sentence of confinement and isolation, a prelude to a final, grim decision. He thought of the slight loosening of Titan's tail, the quiet waft of air. He couldn't let that be the end of the story. Across town, Sarah was putting Lily to bed, the events of the day swirling in her mind. Lily, however, was fixated on one thing only. "Mama, is the sad puppy okay? He needed a friend." Sarah's heart ached. Her daughter, with the pure clarity of a child, had seen past the ferocious reputation to the lonely creature trapped inside. She'd seen what a room full of trained professionals had missed. Later that night, unable to sleep, Sarah found herself searching online: police dog rehabilitation, canine trauma, canine and child connection. She stumbled upon articles about animal behaviorists who specialized in working with traumatized military and police dogs. She bookmarked a page, a seed of an idea planting itself in her mind. She felt a strange, compelling responsibility. Her daughter had opened a door, maybe she could help ensure it wasn't slammed shut. Back at the station, Dan was spending the night in the kennel area, sitting on a crate just outside Titan's Run. He'd done this before, after a particularly rough call, just to be near his partner. But tonight was different. He wasn't there just for comfort, he was there to observe. He spoke to Titan in a low, calm voice, not giving commands, just talking. He talked about Lily, about the look on everyone's faces, about the impossible choice he now faced. Titan lay on his belly, his head on his paws, listening. He didn't growl. He didn't pace. He just listened. The next morning, Dan went to Sergeant Evans with a proposal, a Hail Mary pass to save his partner's life. "Give me 1 week," he pleaded. 1 week with a specialist. "I found a woman, a Dr. Arisha Sharma, she's worked with dogs from war zones. She's based a few hours away. Let her evaluate him. If she says he's a lost cause, I'll accept the board's decision. But if she sees what I saw, we have a chance to do something truly extraordinary here." Evans sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked from Dan's determined, sleep-deprived face to the dog in the kennel, who was watching them with an unnerving intelligence. He was a by-the-book man, but he was also a man who had seen a miracle with his own eyes. Grudgingly, he nodded. 1 week. But Dan, the rules still apply. No unsanctioned contact. He's to be muzzled during any transport. This is his last chance. Don't make me regret this. The following days were a tense, strange limbo. Dan continued his quiet vigils, and Titan continued his uncharacteristically calm behavior. The other officers were divided. Some saw it as a touching story, a chance for redemption. Others saw it as a dangerous distraction, a sentimental gamble that could end in disaster. The station itself felt split, the tension a live wire running through the halls. The day of Dr. Sharma's evaluation arrived. She was a small, quiet woman with calm eyes that missed nothing. She didn't approach Titan's kennel immediately. She just stood and watched from a distance for a long time, observing his posture, his breathing, the way his eyes tracked movement. Dan stood beside her, his own anxiety a knot in his stomach. The future of his partner, the hopes sparked by a little girl in a yellow dress, and his entire career, all rested on the next few hours. Dr. Sharma finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Okay, Officer Miller," she said softly. "Let's see who he really is." The door to the kennel clicked open, and the most important test of Titan's life began. The air in the kennel bay was so still you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. Dr. Sharma stood just inside Titan's Run, having entered with a calm that seemed to defy the very gravity of the situation. She hadn't looked at the dog as a threat or a puzzle. She simply existed in his space, a quiet, non-threatening presence. Dan watched, his knuckles white as he gripped the chain-link fence, every muscle in his body taut. This was it. The one chance. Titan watched her too, his body low to the ground, not in a stalking crouch, but in a posture of deep uncertainty. His ears were swiveling, taking in every tiny sound. For a full 10 minutes, nothing happened. Dr. Sharma didn't speak, didn't try to command him, didn't even look directly at him for more than a second. She just moved slowly, arranging a few simple items on the floor, a plain leather leash, a familiar training dummy, and a single, small, brightly colored child's hair clip that she'd borrowed from Sarah. It was a test of association. She was mapping the landscape of Titan's mind, seeing what each object triggered. The leash and dummy got a flicker of professional interest, a slight forward lean. But the hair clip, that's what made him still. His intense gaze locked onto it, and the low, thoughtful whine that escaped him was one Dan had never heard before. It wasn't aggression. It was recognition. It was memory. Back at her home, Sarah was trying to go about her day, but her mind was at the police station. Lily had drawn a picture for Dan, a stick-figure girl holding hands with a very large, smiling dog. For the sad puppy, she'd said. The innocence of it was a stark contrast to the high-stakes drama unfolding just a few miles away. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She had set this in motion. What if the evaluation went wrong? What if her daughter's brief moment of connection ultimately led to the dog's destruction? The weight of that possibility was crushing. In the kennel, Dr. Sharma began to speak, her voice a soft, steady murmur directed as much at Dan as at the dog. He's not a broken dog, Officer Miller. He's a dog who was never given a choice. His entire world has been about one thing, work and threat. What that little girl did, she offered him a choice. And for the first time, he chose something else. She took a slow step towards Titan, not with her hand out, but with her side turned, a universally submissive gesture in the animal kingdom. Titan didn't retreat. He took a single, hesitant step forward, his nose twitching as he sampled her scent. Dan's breath hitched. This was further than anyone but Lily had ever gotten. Then, Dr. Sharma did something that made Dan's heart stop. She slowly reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, high-value training treat, a piece of dried liver. It was a standard reward, but offering it by hand to Titan was like sticking your hand into a lion's mouth. The entire precinct seemed to hold its breath. Titan looked from the treat to her face, his body tense with internal conflict. The old programming, suspicion, isolation, was battling against this new, fragile curiosity. He leaned in, his movements so slow it was barely perceptible. His lips brushed her fingers, and he took the treat with a delicacy that was astonishing for such a powerful animal. He didn't snap. He didn't even drool. He just took it, chewed, and then looked back up at her, his expression unreadable. A wave of cautious relief washed over Dan. He dared to hope. But Dr. Sharma's face remained serious. "This is good," she said quietly. "But this is the easy part. We've shown he can be calm in a controlled environment with a specialist. The review board will need to see more. They'll need to see if this change is real, if it holds under pressure." She looked directly at Dan. "We need to test him in a scenario. A controlled simulation of his work, but with this new variable introduced. We need to see if the dog who connected with a little girl can still be a police dog, or if that connection has fundamentally changed him." The plan was set for the following day. They would use the department's training yard. An officer in a padded bite suit would play the role of a suspect. Titan would be tasked with the apprehension. But partway through, Dan would step into the field, not as his handler, but as a neutral figure. The goal was to see if Titan could disengage from his high-drive work mode on a command, or, more importantly, if he would recognize Dan not just as a commander, but as a person, a partner, outside of the context of the chase. It was a dangerous gamble. If Titan failed, if he redirected his aggression or became confused, it would confirm everyone's worst fears and seal his fate. The next morning, the training yard felt like a coliseum. Sergeant Evans and a few other high-ranking officers watched from a safe observation platform. The air was cold and crisp. Dan suited up, his K9 harness feeling heavier than ever. He looked at Titan, who was buzzing with pre-work energy, his focus already sharpening on the field. This was the dog he knew. The living weapon. Could the dog who took a treat so gently from a stranger still exist inside this coiled spring of power? He gave the command. "Revere." Titan exploded from his side, a black and tan streak of pure purpose, closing the distance on the suspect with terrifying speed. The chase was on. The dog was in his element, and he was perfect. But as Dan watched, his heart wasn't filled with pride, it was filled with a cold, gripping fear. Because Titan looked more like the old, isolated, aggressive dog than he had in days. The climax was here. Dan's cue was approaching. In moments, he would have to step onto that field and call his partner back from the edge. He would have to find out if the bond they had was stronger than the instincts that had defined Titan for so long. He took a deep breath, his pulse thundering in his ears, and prepared to walk into the path of the storm. The world narrowed to the dusty training yard. Titan was a blur of focused aggression, his powerful body slamming into the padded officer with a force that echoed across the field. He had the suit's arm in his mouth, locked in a vice-like grip, his deep growl of vibration you could feel in your bones. This was the Titan everyone feared. The perfect, unfeeling machine. Dan's throat was dry. This was the moment. He stepped out from his position, his heart hammering against his ribs. Titan. AUS. The release command left his lips, sharp and clear. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The dog didn't even seem to hear him, his entire being consumed by the takedown. The officers on the platform shifted uneasily. This was exactly what they had been afraid of. Then, a flicker. Titan's ear twitched. The relentless growling faltered for a split second. He didn't let go, but he turned his head, just an inch, and his amber eyes found Dan's. In that glance, Dan saw the conflict raging inside him, the deep-seated drive to hold on warring with a new, unfamiliar impulse to listen. And then, the unthinkable happened. From the parking lot beyond the chain-link fence, a small, familiar figure darted out. Lily. She had slipped away from her mother, who was talking to Sergeant Evans, her little legs carrying her toward the exciting scene with the puppy. She was clutching her drawing, her yellow dress a bright splash of color against the grim training yard. "Puppy," she called out, her voice cutting through the tension. Everything seemed to snap into slow motion. Dan's blood ran cold. Sarah screamed from the parking lot. The officer in the bite suit froze, unsure of what to do. Titan's head swiveled completely now, his focus utterly shattered. He saw the little girl. He saw the running, the high-pitched voice, the flapping piece of paper, all triggers that would normally send him into a higher state of alert. The dog released the suit arm, turning fully toward the fence. A low, uncertain rumble started in his chest. It wasn't the clean, professional growl from moments before. This was the sound of a confused, powerful animal whose world had just been turned upside down. Dan was already moving, his training kicking in even as his mind screamed. He positioned himself between the dog and the fence, his hands up, his voice dropping to a low, calming register. "Titan. Fuss." He commanded him to heel. But Titan didn't heel. He took a step toward the fence, then another, his body low, his gaze fixed on Lily, who had now stopped, suddenly aware of the tense silence she had created. Dr. Sharma, who had been observing quietly, spoke urgently into her radio to the officers on the platform. "Do not intervene. Do not shout. Any sudden movement or noise could trigger a defensive reaction." She understood what Dan was realizing in his gut. This was no longer a test. This was a real-world crisis, more dangerous than any training scenario they could have devised. The stakes had just skyrocketed from saving a career to saving a life. Titan was at the fence now, his nose pressing against the links, his rumbling growl softening into a confused whine. Lily, her bottom lip starting to tremble, slowly held up her drawing, pressing it against the fence on her side. "I drew this for you," she whispered. The dog fell silent. He sniffed the paper, his warm breath fogging the crayon lines. He looked at the little girl's face, then back at Dan, who stood frozen a few yards away, his own fate and the child's safety hanging in the balance. Titan was caught between two worlds, the one he was built for, full of threats and commands, and this new, confusing one, full of gentle touches and crayon drawings. He was at the absolute breaking point. Dan knew the next move, the next sound, the next breath, would decide everything. He held his own breath, waiting for the dog to make a choice, praying that the connection forged in a quiet kennel was strong enough to hold against the roar of a lifetime of instinct. The world held its breath. Titan stood at the fence, his massive body a silhouette of tension, his nose still pressed against Lily's crayon drawing. The low rumble in his chest had faded, replaced by a silence that was somehow even more terrifying. Dan didn't move a muscle. He knew any sound, any gesture, could be the spark. He could see the war in Titan's eyes, the instinct to see a running child as a target battling against the memory of that same child's gentle hand. Then, Titan took a step back from the fence. He didn't look at Lily. Instead, he turned and walked slowly toward Dan. His head was lowered, not in submission, but in what looked like deference. He stopped directly in front of his handler, sat, and looked up, waiting. It was the perfect heel position. The command had been heard, processed, and obeyed, just moments too late, but obeyed nonetheless. A collective, shuddering sigh of relief passed through the small crowd of observers. But the climax wasn't over. As Dan reached out, his hand trembling slightly, to attach the leash to Titan's collar, the dog did something he had never, ever done before. He leaned forward and gently nudged his broad head into Dan's chest. It wasn't a demand for a reward or a response to a command. It was a seek for comfort. A connection. Dan's hand, which had been moving to clip the leash, instead rested on Titan's head, his fingers sinking into the coarse fur. In that touch, 3 years of barriers and professional distance simply melted away. The weapon had chosen to become a partner. The review board, having witnessed the entire shocking event, was left with an impossible decision. The dog had, in a moment of extreme stress, ultimately obeyed. He had shown a capacity for connection that defied his entire history. But he had also hesitated, and a hesitation in the field could be fatal. The debate that followed was long and heated. Finally, a compromise was reached, one so unprecedented it sent ripples through the entire department. Titan would not be returned to active street duty. The risk was too great. But he would not be benched or retired. He was given a new role, one that no one could have imagined for him just a week prior. He became the department's first dedicated K-9 ambassador for juvenile outreach. His job was to work with Dr. Sharma and Dan, visiting schools and community centers, helping children who were fearful of police or dogs. The very intensity that once made him frightening, his size, his deep bark, his powerful presence, now became a tool. Under Dan's gentle guidance and with Lily often by his side as his tiny, trusted friend, he showed kids that even the most intimidating things could be gentle. He taught them about courage, trust, and second chances. The story seemed to have found its perfect, heartwarming ending. Titan had found his purpose, Dan had found a deeper bond with his partner, and Lily had her sad puppy. But life had one final, beautiful twist in store. Months into his new role, during a quiet visit to a local children's hospital, Titan was leading Dan down a hallway when he suddenly stopped. He pulled gently on his leash, leading a confused Dan toward a closed door. He sat down and whined softly. A nurse, seeing them, looked surprised. "That's Mia's room," she said. "She's a little girl who was brought in last night. She's not doing well, and she's terrified of everyone." With permission, Dan slowly opened the door. Inside, a small, pale girl was curled up in her bed, her eyes wide with fear. She saw Titan and flinched, pulling the covers over her head. Dan was about to apologize and leave when Titan, without a command, lay down on the floor right inside the doorway. He put his head on his paws, his body relaxed and non-threatening, and he let out that same soft, quiet woof he had given Lily on that first day. He didn't move. He just waited. After a long minute, a single eye peeked out from under the blanket. Then, a small hand emerged. Titan's tail gave one, single, gentle thump against the floor. The connection was made. In that moment, Dan understood the final, unexpected truth. Titan's gift wasn't just for Lily. It was a profound, innate ability to find the most fragile soul in the room and speak to it in a language only they understood. The aggressive police dog that nobody could touch had not just been saved, he had become a healer. And his most important work was only just beginning. The quiet waft from Titan seemed to hang in the sterilized hospital air, a soft question mark in a room filled with fear. Dan held his breath, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. He watched as the little girl, Mia, slowly lowered the blanket from her face. Her eyes, wide and glassy from tears, were fixed on the massive dog lying so still on the floor. He was so big, he should have been frightening. But his stillness was a language she understood. It was the stillness of someone who wasn't going to demand anything from her. Dan didn't push. He simply sat on the floor a few feet behind Titan, mirroring his partner's calm. He spoke in a low, steady voice, not to Mia, but to Titan. "You're a good boy, just taking a rest," he murmured. "It's a good spot for it." He was giving Mia a narrative, a safe way to observe without pressure. For 10 minutes, nothing changed. Then, Mia's hand, small and pale against the white sheets, pointed a single finger towards Titan. It was a tiny gesture, but in that room, it felt like a victory. From that day on, Titan's path was irrevocably set. His work as the K9 ambassador expanded in ways the department could never have planned. He and Dan, often accompanied by Lily on her weekends, became regular visitors not just at schools, but at children's hospitals and trauma centers. Titan had an uncanny sense for it. He would walk into a room full of anxious children and unerringly gravitate towards the one who was most withdrawn, the one who hadn't spoken in days, the one who flinched at loud noises. He would perform his now signature move, lying down just out of arm's reach and waiting. He offered a silent, patient invitation that no human therapist could ever replicate. Sergeant Evans, the man who had once argued for Titan's benching, became one of his biggest advocates. He'd often show visiting officers from other districts a video of Titan sitting patiently while a group of toddlers clumsily patted his back. "See that?" he'd say, a note of pride in his voice. "That dog used to be our most aggressive unit. Now, he's our most effective one. He's changing people's minds about what a police dog can be." The K9 program itself began to evolve, incorporating more socialization and emotional intelligence training for new dogs, inspired by Titan's unexpected journey. For Dan, the change was profoundly personal. The relationship that had once been built solely on commands and respect was now woven with something deeper. In the evenings, after their community visits, Titan would no longer retreat to his kennel. He would lie on a rug in Dan's office, his head on his paws, watching his partner do paperwork. Sometimes, Dan would just sit with him, not saying a word, his hand resting on the dog's side, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of his breathing. The wall was gone. Titan wasn't just his partner on the job, he was his friend. Lily, of course, remained Titan's first and most special friend. She saw him not as a reformed weapon or a therapy dog, but simply as her puppy. She would arrive for visits, her small backpack filled with his favorite treats and new drawings to show him. Their bond was a pure, simple thing that had been the catalyst for it all. Sarah watched her daughter with a heart full of gratitude and awe. The terrifying incident that could have ended in tragedy had instead blossomed into something beautiful, teaching her daughter about compassion, courage, and the power of a gentle touch. One sunny afternoon, a year after Lily first walked into his kennel, the department held a small, informal ceremony in the community park. Titan was being officially recognized for his service in the new community outreach program. A small crowd had gathered, officers, families, and children whose lives Titan had touched. Mia was there, holding her mother's hand, a small, shy smile on her face. As Dan stood to accept a plaque, he looked out at the crowd, at the faces of the children, at his colleagues, and then down at Titan, who sat patiently by his side, wearing a simple blue bandana. "They say every dog has a purpose," Dan began, his voice a little rough with emotion. "For a long time, we thought Titan's purpose was all about force. About being the toughest, the fastest, the most intimidating. We were wrong." He reached down and scratched behind Titan's ear. The dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing in contentment. His real purpose was always about connection. He just needed someone to show him the way. A little girl was brave enough to see the good boy hiding behind the tough exterior, and she taught us all a lesson about not judging a book by its cover.